I. In the spring of 1917, when Dr. Richard Diver first arrived in Zurich, he was 26 years old, a fine age for a man, indeed the very acme of bachelorhood. Even in wartime days, it was a fine age for Dick, who was already too valuable, too much of a capital investment to be shot off in a gun. Years later it seemed to him that even in this sanctuary he did not escape lightly, but about that he never fully made up his mind. In 1917 he laughed at the idea, saying apologetically that the war didn't touch him at all. Instructions from his local board were that he was to complete his studies in Zurich and take a degree as he had planned. Switzerland was an island, washed on one side by the waves of thunder around Gorizia and on another by the cataracts along the Somme and the Aisne. For once there seemed more intriguing strangers than sick ones in the cantons, but that had to be guessed at. The men who whispered in the little cafés of Bern and Geneva were as likely to be diamond salesmen or commercial travelers. However, no one had missed the long trains of blinded or one-legged men, or dying trunks, that crossed each other between the bright lakes of Constance and Neuchâtel. In the beer halls and shop windows were bright posters presenting the Swiss defending their frontiers in 1914, with inspiring ferocity young men and old men glared down from the mountains at phantom French and Germans. The purpose was to assure the Swiss heart that it had shared the contagious glory of those days. As the massacre continued, the posters withered away, and no country was more surprised than its sister republic when the United States bungled its way into the war. Dr. Diver had seen around the edges of the war by that time. He was an Oxford Rhodes Scholar from Connecticut in 1914. He returned home for a final year at Johns Hopkins, and took his degree. In 1916 he managed to get to Vienna under the impression that, if he did not make haste, the great Freud would eventually succumb to an aeroplane bomb. Even then Vienna was old with death, but Dick managed to get enough coal and oil to sit in his room in the Damon Stiftstrasse and write the pamphlets that he later destroyed, but that, rewritten, were the backbone of the book he published in Zurich in 1920. Most of us have a favorite, a heroic period, in our lives, and that was Dick Diver's. For one thing, he had no idea that he was charming, that the affection he gave and inspired was anything unusual among healthy people. In his last year at New Haven someone referred to him as Lucky Dick. The name lingered in his head. Lucky Dick, you big stiff, he would whisper to himself, walking around the last sticks of flame in his room. You hit it, my boy. Nobody knew it was there before you came along. At the beginning of 1917, when it was becoming difficult to find coal, Dick burned for fuel almost 100 textbooks that he had accumulated, but only, as he laid each one on the fire, with an assurance chuckling inside him that he was himself a digest of what was within the book, that he could brief it 5 years from now, if it deserved to be briefed. This went on at any odd hour, if necessary, with a floor rug over his shoulders, with the fine quiet of the scholar which is nearest of all things to heavenly peace, but which, as will presently be told, had to end. For its temporary continuance he thanked his body that had done the flying rings at New Haven, and now swam in the winter Danube. With Elkins, second secretary at the embassy, he shared an apartment, and there were 2 nice girl visitors, which was that and not too much of it, nor too much of the embassy either. His contact with Ed Elkins aroused in him a first faint doubt as to the quality of his mental processes. He could not feel that they were profoundly different from the thinking of Elkins, who would name you all the quarterbacks in New Haven for 30 years. And Lucky Dick can't be one of these clever men, he must be less intact, even faintly destroyed. If life won't do it for him, it's not a substitute to get a disease, or a broken heart, or an inferiority complex, though it'd be nice to build out some broken side till it was better than the original structure. He mocked at his reasoning, calling it specious and American. His criteria of uncerebral phrase-making was that it was American. He knew, though, that the price of his intactness was incompleteness. The best I can wish you, my child, so said the fairy Blackstick in Thackeray's The Rose and the Ring, is a little misfortune. In some moods he griped at his own reasoning. Could I help it that Pete Livingstone sat in the locker room tap day when everybody looked all over hell for him? And I got an election when otherwise I wouldn't have got Elihu, knowing so few men. He was good and right, and I ought to have sat in the locker room instead. Maybe I would, if I'd thought I had a chance at an election. But Mercer kept coming to my room all those weeks. I guess I knew I had a chance all right, all right. But it would have served me right if I'd swallowed my pin in the shower and set up a conflict. After the lectures at the university, he used to argue this point with a young Romanian intellectual who reassured him, there's no evidence that Goethe ever had a conflict in the modern sense, or a man like Jung, for instance. You're not a romantic philosopher, you're a scientist. Memory, force, character, especially good sense. That's going to be your trouble, judgment about yourself. Once I knew a man who worked 2 years on the brain of an armadillo, with the idea that he would sooner or later know more about the brain of an armadillo than anyone. I kept arguing with him that he was not really pushing out the extension of the human range, it was too arbitrary. And sure enough, when he sent his work to the medical journal they refused it, they had just accepted a thesis by another man on the same subject. Dick got up to Zurich on less Achilles' heels than would be required to equip a centipede, but with plenty, the illusions of eternal strength and health, and of the essential goodness of people, illusions of a nation, the lies of generations of frontier mothers who had to croon falsely, that there were no wolves outside the cabin door. After he took his degree, he received his orders to join a neurological unit forming in Bar-sur-Aube. In France, to his disgust, the work was executive rather than practical. In compensation, he found time to complete the short textbook and assemble the material for his next venture. He returned to Zurich in the spring of 1919 discharged. The foregoing has the ring of a biography, without the satisfaction of knowing that the hero, like Grant, lolling in his general store in Galena, is ready to be called to an intricate destiny. Moreover, it is confusing to come across a youthful photograph of someone known in a rounded maturity and gaze with a shock upon a fiery, wiry, eagle-eyed stranger. Best to be reassuring, Dick Diver's moment now began.